Good. Well, I have the great honor of introducing Sheridan, who's going to bless us with a little bit of music. Um, as a lot of folks know, Sheridan Gold is a member of Ner Shalom's Good Shabbos band, and she began playing the flute at 8 years old, the silver flute. And in addition to the silver flute, she also plays alto flute, Native American flute, and I think you told me once like 27 different kinds of flute. Is that? No, I made that up. Okay, a lot of different flutes. Also West African drumming and the handpan. Um, Sheridan has a K through 12 teaching credential in music education, and she teaches still group classes and private lessons. I was lucky enough to take a drumming class from her once, and she's an amazing teacher. So as those of us who come to Shabbos service often know, almost every week, Sheridan begins the service with music that supports the transition between the regular pace of the week and the holiness of Shabbat. And she's certainly been heard to say that playing music is one of the ways in which she prays. So I'm delighted to welcome Sheridan to the spotlight, to share some music with us to support the transition from all the things that we just put into our heads to the place that we need to be in our heart for what's next.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Oh, well, it's a lot of stuff up in there, and I just want to invite us to just, close your eyes, get up, move, lie down, take yourself off camera. I'll be playing a little bit of handpan, a little bit of native flute, and for about 10 minutes, I think. So there's no expectations. If you can't hear, turn your volume up. If it's too loud, turn your volume down. So I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you. That was so beautiful. Love you.
Hi there. I see that I am spotlighted. Sheridan, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. Um, um,
I can quietly introduce you
okay.
if you'd like. We have a number of people here tonight who are not regular groupies of Reb Irwin's and Congregation Ner Shalom. And I just want to say, for those of you who didn't register and are here tonight, if you do want to get a link for the recordings for all of the sessions, please put your name and your email in the chat so that we can follow up with you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Reb Irwin for those of you who don't yet know him, which is, I think, probably very few of you. He's been the spiritual leader of Congregation Ner Shalom since 2008, although he started dabbling from 2006 on. And he's the founder and faculty of the Taproot community since 2017, authored Chicago's first comprehensive human rights law, in effect since 1989, and served at the helm of the AIDS legal referral panel of the San Francisco Bay Area. He's the founder of the Kinsey Six, America's favorite Dragapella beauty shop quartet, and is the author of Shekinah at the Art Institute, Words, Worry, and Wonder, published last year by Blue Light Press. He's also been known to dabble in blogging at his irwinkeller.com account, and frequently posts his drosh from services, which are, if anything, the antithesis of traditional, except on rare occasion. Tonight he's going to be talking about gender expressiveness in the human and the divine. And I know I'm going to be sitting back in my seat, sipping iced tea, and being in a place to receive the words of Reb Irwin as he comes off the mountaintop and starts living again among us in the flatlands.
Thank you, Barbara. Um, the uh, that's a tall order. Um, uh, we're all on this mountain together and learning together. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm so grateful that this community has developed this tradition of the Zoom Tikkun. Um, I see and just want to recognize my beloved friend and colleague, Rabbi Diane Elliott, who's coming to us from somewhere. I don't know where. Um, where are you, Diane?
I'm in Moore Park, California, Ventura County, having just experienced the most amazing Jewish Guatemalan wedding in my family. So
Oh, wonderful. Mazel tov to you.
thank you.
Um, so tonight I've been feeling the need to respond to some of the terribleness going on in the world, um, with some with a good, toolkit of uh, Jewish text and history. Um, we're living in this time when, after years of the development of sort of a movement that's allowed people to express themselves and their gender however they are feeling it, and that becoming sort of much more normalized in our community and in many communities. This has become the thing that, I guess everything is the thing right now, but this has become a major point for the right wing in this country. It's easy political points to go after transgender people for being transgender. And it's popular and it's frightening. Transgender people are in real danger of violence wherever they live in this country. And I thought it was important for us to continue on the road that we're on, but with greater knowledge of what Judaism has to say about gender and about gender expression and about you'll forgive me if I'm a little incoherent because I barely slept last night, so I'm already kind of sleep deprived. But I want to talk about some of our mythos around gender in Torah and in Talmud. And I also want to talk about some like tachlis, some specifics about how gender is talked about in Talmud, which is very different from the gender binary that say the Trumpians would tell you is the limitation of gender, that there are only two genders. I want to open us all up to how Judaism has looked at gender in the past. So I'm going to start. I'm going to do a screen share. Hang on a moment. Here we go. Are you all able to see that? I'm going to presume so.
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Terrific. So we were talking, I think, in the first session with Oren and Michael about sort of this idea of there being sort of a non-dual, a wholeness out of which creation emerges, and creation starts dividing things into heaven and earth, into land and sky, into land and sea, and then the plants and the animals. All of this diversity, all of this particularity, separateness emerges out of like an underlying wholeness. Right in the first chapter of Genesis, right in the description of the creation of human beings, we see the establishment, we seem to see the establishment of a gender binary. This is where we see the birth of two genders. And I'm showing it to you right here. If you can see my cursor circling Genesis 1:27, when first God says, let us create the human being in our image. And that in itself is a complicated, confusing statement. Who is God talking to? And who is the us in the our image? But we'll let that go for now and go to this verse where it says, then, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar unekeva bara otam. So God created the human, which in Hebrew is Adam. Adam is not initially a name. Adam is just the Hebrew word for human. God created the Adam in God's image. B'tzelem Elohim bara oto. God created Adam, created him or it, in the image of God, creating them male and female. So right there we see that. But then that becomes a little bit of a problem in Torah, because in the next chapter, where we get the second creation story, where we get Adam and Adam's rib, if God already created male and female, then why does God need to take a rib out of Adam in order to create female? They are both created already. So in this telling, you'll see in Genesis 2:21 and 22, Vayipol Adonai Elohim, Vayapel Adonai Elohim tardema al ha'adam vayishan vayikach chad mitzal otav vayiskor basar tachtena vayiven Adonai. Well, I'll give it to you in English. So Adonai cast a deep sleep on the Adam, on the human, and while the Adam slept, God took one of his tzilaot. So this is a word we're going to have to come back to. It gets translated over and over in our in English as rib, right? Adam's rib. God takes one of the Adam's ribs and closes up the flesh at the site. And Adonai fashioned that rib, the tzela, that had been taken from the Adam into a woman, Isha, and brought her to the Adam. Okay, so here we have then the separation into two genders, and the Adam, now we begin to see the biases of the patriarchal telling of this creation story, is that the Adam, the human, remains the male. After the rib is taken, there's just one human, the rib is taken, now there's a woman, and the woman is brought to the Adam. So this conflation of the male and the human. What it is to be human is to be male. What it is to be male is to be human. But then we see in Midrash, which is now in Roman antiquity, so a couple thousand years ago, in a very different, I would say in some ways Torah is written for a people who are living in their own land, and Talmud is written for a people who are either now in their own land but under Roman occupation, or who are already in diaspora. So Talmud is written at a time when where Jewish life is interacting with the life of Rome or the life of Persia. And so new ideas are coming in, including, I think, new ideas about gender. And some of these influence how the rabbis see things. Sometimes they react against the outer culture and clamp down on gender in Judaism, but sometimes surprisingly not. So here we see a midrash that's trying to understand why is it that in the first chapter of Genesis we see man and woman, male and female are created, and then in chapter 2 we have one Adam, we have one human, and part of the human is taken in order to create a woman. So Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, when the Holy Blessed One created the first human, the Adam, he created him androgynous, as it is written, male and female he created them. So he's rereading the creation of humanity where it says God created Adam, male and female. Instead of those being separate people, that initial Adam, that initial human, was both male and female. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman says, when the Holy One, blessed be, created the first human, he created him with two faces, du partsufim, it says in Hebrew. He created him with two faces. Subsequently, he sawed him in two. And so now you're picturing a human with a male face facing one way, a female face maybe facing the other way, and now God saws the person in half and made for him two backs, a back here and a back there. So God there was a two-faced, two-bodied person, and there was a person who contained both genders, both traditional genders, and God separated that human into two. And of course, the other rabbis are like, but, the verse says God took a rib out of Adam. So how do you justify this story about an original being that gets sawed in half? And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman responds, it means the word tzela, which is commonly rib, is also used in Torah to mean the sides of the altar. And so if we understand tzela in this case not to mean rib, but to mean a side, then you have a person who has two sides and is then separated. And the reason I wanted to just touch on this one quickly at the beginning, this particular story, is because it's kind of fabulous, and because the opening of this is, let us make the human in our image. And so if then the rabbis are imagining, or some of the rabbis are imagining, that God says, "Let's make the human in our image," and then God makes a human who embodies both male and female characteristics, then there is a suggestion there about the gender of the divine, that the divine encompasses more than the traditional human binary of genders, and that's there is there is a piece, there's a really interesting idea in there that I think is kind of sly and kind of transgressive. Um, Throughout Torah, God is referred to as He. I can't think of a place in Torah where God is referred to in any gender other than He. And so later on you have Maimonides, and Rabbi George will tell us about Maimonides in an hour. You have Maimonides saying, well, everything you say about God is untrue. Everything is a metaphor in some way. Any descriptor of God is necessarily untrue. But for the rabbis of the Talmud, it was all true. And so they are suggesting something about God and gender. They are subtly saying, no, God is not male. Okay, let's get down to human beings. So here is the thing, is that we are going to find a bunch of things here, and some of them will delight us and some of them won't. So I'm not gonna lie to you and say, oh, there's all of this great stuff in our textual history but I think that there will be an excitement of finding ourselves, of seeing ourselves reflected in our texts, even if the content of what we're reading is something that could be a bit of a bummer. I had dinner last week with someone who's a scholar of medieval literature and medieval French literature, and he was telling me about his dissertation. He said, and there was even a queer studies angle, and I'm like, oh, what was the queer studies angle? Because I'm thinking there's maybe some beautiful queer love poetry or something that he included in his dissertation. He said, oh yeah, there's this conversation, this correspondence between a noble person and the queen or whatever, and she says to him, be careful of so and so, he's a sodomite. And like there was a moment of wah wah, and I kind of responded, well, it's nice to be noticed, sometimes that's the best we can do, is look back and say, okay, I don't like the content of this, but it shows that we were there. And noticing that we were there is actually really, really significant. At least it is for me. It gives me a much more of, who would I have been then? What would my life have been like? My life as a queer person has involved struggle. If I lived then, yeah, it might have involved struggle also. But let's look at what Torah gives us. So the book of Deuteronomy is where we get we start getting the explicit enforcement of gender norms. And you could look at that in a variety of ways. And Deuteronomy is a later book that has a big political agenda, right? It's a retelling of lots of the rest of Torah, and it's got an angle. But I'm not. I just want us to sort of look at the plain text of it, and see what it feels like. Oh, and I also just, by the way, want to invite you, if I'm not seeing you all easily because I'm looking at this document, but if there's a comment you'd like to make or a question, feel free to just unmute and call my attention. So here in Deuteronomy, we have what for me is a biggie. Lo yihiyeh chli gever al isha velo yilbash gever simlat isha ki toevat Adonai Elohecha kol oseh ele. A woman must not put on man's gear, nor shall a man wear a woman's dress, for whoever does these things is abhorrent to to Adonai your God. Sorry, that's a typo. To Adonai your God. So there are a few things to notice here. One thing is that you notice it's not exactly symmetrical. Women are not supposed to wear kli gever, which is men's gear or men's equipment or men's tools. Some read it as weapons, whereas the man is not supposed to wear woman's garb. And that's kind of interesting. And people have written about this. And certainly that affects how the rabbis later interpret this verse. They notice that for the women, it seems to be something about tools, and they talk about it as being weapons for war. In any event, so the first thing to notice maybe is that it's not exactly symmetrical, and there's something curious about that. The next thing to notice is this is a really strong prohibition. It's called a toeva. It's called what's another word English for toeva? Oren? What? How do you say toeva? Abomination. Abomination. It's an abomination. That's like a very strong word. On the other hand, I look at this. It's like this would not be such a severe prohibition if it weren't happening with some in some widespread way. We can look at this and see back in Torah times or before Torah times, there are women who are, what the culture perceived as women doing man stuff, and there are what the culture perceived as men doing women stuff. And it was widespread enough that just saying don't do it wasn't enough. It had to go to the abomination place. Maybe on another day or on your as a homework assignment, we could think about what does this have to do with the emergence of patriarchal religion? If, say, in goddess religion times, you have more freedom of gender expression, or you have a priesthood where there is a freedom of how to dress and how to self-express, and then an emergence of patriarchy where really, like, God is male and privilege goes to men. Like, what is the importance of stopping whatever permeability there is between male gender expression and female gender expression? There's some commentary here from Ibn Ezra, a medieval commentator. He says, blah, blah, blah. Is this where it was? There, in both cases, wait, let's see. Yeah, this passage is next to one about going out to war. This passage in Torah, this verse. Because woman is created to raise children, and if she goes out to war with the men, she will fall into the ways of licentiousness. And similarly, the prohibition on men wearing women's clothes. A man who has not yet come into his full beard and who dresses as a woman can mix among the women and engage in fornication, and her husband wouldn't know. For this reason, it is the custom of Israel and other nations for men and women to dress differently. There are those who say this is about unusual sexual practice, but one needn't reach that conclusion. God abhors anyone who interferes with God's design. So there's a lot in that should probably feel familiar from our era. God's design, that somehow not only the bodies that we're born with, but the gender we're assigned is God's design, and anything and any deviation from the expected gender presentation is against God's design. So that sounds kind of familiar in a 20th and 21st century kind of way. Also, this bit about, fornication could happen. Like, there's a whole worry about deceit. There's a whole worry about someone getting away with something. And that's this whole passage just keeps reading to me like the bathroom debate, right? It's like, if a woman wants to fight in the war, if a man it's this idea that somehow someone will commit fraud by posing as another gender. And so I'm just noticing that as well, that thread that we find in our culture, and it keeps getting expressed in the bathroom debates, and maybe arguably in the athletics debates. Here it is alive and well in Jewish Middle Ages, and he's summarizing also material that comes from earlier, from Talmud eras. In Talmud, the rabbis continue to wonder about what are the parameters of this prohibition. The prohibition specifically says that a man shall not wear a woman's simla, her dress or her clothing. But they have to talk about, so what if he wears jewelry? What if he wears cosmetics? And they have to debate about it. I mean, they decide, what if he shaves his body hair? And they decide that it is punishable as if he were wearing a dress. That is how strict the rabbis are on that. I'm suspecting that it has to do also with fencing off Jews from the non-Jewish Romans, Greeks, Persians, who probably had a lot more freedom around their gender expression. And so it created kind of a reactionary enforcement among the rabbis. So yeah, not only not a dress, right? So yesterday, what I wore at Pride yesterday with long earrings and a skirt, but the rest of it was kind of boyish, would be equally punishable by these rabbis. Then in the conversation, this is just an interesting little side note, is then they remember that Rabbi Yochanan, who was famously beautiful and also famously feminine, did not have armpit hair. And they sort of turned to him. I mean, this is how Talmud is edited. They probably were not in a conversation with each other, but they turned to him and he responds, well, it all fell out due to old age. I just find that amusing in some way. Also in Deuteronomy, while we are cracking down on practices that feel non-Jewish, there's a prohibition just a chapter away from what we just read that says, "Lo tiyeh kadesha mibnot Yisrael v'lo yihiyeh kadesh mibnei Yisrael." No Israelite woman shall be a kadesha, nor shall any Israelite man be a kadesh, which is traditionally understood to be the kadesha and the kadesh are traditionally understood to be priests and priestesses, probably of the goddess. So it seems to be a prohibition on idolatry, on non-Israelite cultic practice. But interestingly, the Aramaic translation of it, which I have here below, here I'll make it a little bigger for you to see, maybe I can't. The translation of it below is, an Israelite woman shall not become a serving man, and an Israelite man shall not become a maidservant. So while the simple text of the Torah doesn't seem to be talking about gender or gender expression, already a little bit later, when Jews are not speaking Hebrew, and so it has to be translated into Aramaic for them, the most famous translator of Torah already translates it as a gender transgression. That's not clearly present in the Torah text itself. Okay, so a lot of that might have been buzzkillish. Did that feel buzzkillish to you? No? Leah is still here. She says it's interesting. I want to, you all know, because I've been on this soapbox before, that I've written pretty extensively about the character of Joseph in Torah and the range of gender markers that arise in in the telling of the Joseph story, both around Joseph's body, the Torah talks about Joseph's breasts, about Joseph's knees, in a way that's usually only talked about regarding women who are giving women in childbirth. His beauty is talked about in feminine terms. Their clothing also uses terms that Torah understands to be feminine, and Joseph's social role as well. So in this, I don't know if we put into the chat, if somebody could put into the chat the actual link to the document we're looking at here, then you can download it yourself, and you can highlight this link and pop it into your browser, and that'll bring you to the Reconstructing Judaism's reprinting of my paper on that. And you can spend some quality time with Joseph, who I hold as a transcessor in our tradition. The reason I loved finding these things about Joseph was in order to help us all see ourselves in Torah. And we could talk more about that another time. But now I want to bring you to this really very interesting piece in Talmud. Once you have a crackdown on gender, once you have a legal system and a social system that gives certain rights and responsibilities to men, and certain rights and responsibilities, or certain lack of rights and excess of responsibilities to women, then and you live in a time and a place where not everyone's gender is obvious, then you start creating you can start creating gatekeeping. So Talmud actually, and so for instance, laws about marriage, divorce, who can be a priest or a high priest, who can inherit, who can serve as a judge, who can give testimony in court, all of that is specific to gender. And so the culture needs to be able to say who is a man and who is a woman. Now, it's leaving aside our ideas about gender as it's assigned, just looking at human bodies. There's a lot of variation in human bodies, including in sexual development. In our culture, in modern Western culture, the presence of people whose sexual anatomy varies from the norm has been suppressed, really until quite recently. In fact, in 20th century America, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, if a child was born with ambiguous genitalia, the child would be submitted to non-consensual surgeries to try to normalize their genitals so that they could clearly be seen as male or female. And this is something that activists have been actively working on for the past couple of decades to try to stop that from happening, and to stop both the non-consensual surgeries and the lifelong consequences of having those surgeries, which are considerable, and also the shame and secrecy associated with it. I myself know intersex people. Oh, and so like having sort of a difference in sexual anatomy is called intersex. And I know intersex people who were subjected to surgery after surgery as children, and they were told they had cancer because it was too shameful to tell them, or to risk that other people would find out about their child's difference. In ancient times, you didn't have that option. Like everyone knew intersex people. Everyone knew people whose bodies were different in this way. And Talmud has to make sense of what are the rights and responsibilities of people whose bodies are different from what you would expect from male and what you would expect from female. So I'm showing you right here this chart. This is a chart of the six sexes that Talmud talks about, and it talks about these sexes hundreds of times. This is not like a passing thing that, I or people like me are grabbing and saying, oh, there's some evidence that somebody existed. This is like over and over and over, because there's so many areas of Jewish law that are reliant on gender. So we'll just look at them. So Zachar is a typical, what we would call cisgender male. And again, we're looking really at bodies. We're not yet looking at kind of social gender or gender expression. We're really kind of looking at bodies in this bit. At least that's what Talmud seems to be talking about, bodies. Zachar is sort of typical male anatomy. Nekeva, typical female anatomy. Then there is androgynos. Androgynos, which Talmud talks about as a person who seems to be a person who exhibits both male and female sexual characteristics. Androgynos is referenced 149 times in Talmud and 350 times in classical midrash and Jewish legal codes. That's a lot. Androgynos comes up a lot. Another category, tumtum, a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate. So, in other words, instead of having some typically male characteristics and some typically female, this is a person who doesn't have typically either. A person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured, referenced 181 times in Talmud and 335 in Midrash. Saris, which is traditionally translated as eunuch, is a person who's identified as male at birth, but who then develops female characteristics. And it's also there are subcategories, including someone whose penis was cut off, because in Torah law there are roles you can't play. You can't be you can't be a priest in the temple. Saris, referenced 156 times in Talmud, 379 times in the other texts. And the last one that's mentioned is Ailonit, a person who's identified as female at birth, but then develops typically male characteristics at puberty and is infertile. 80 references in Talmud and 40 in Midrash. So this is just sort of defining these categories through description of body. But now I want you to notice, then what the decisions the rabbis make about the legal and social consequences. So someone whose body is clearly identified as male is treated as male in the law. Someone whose body is clearly, typically, non-controversially female is treated as female. The androgynos that we talked about before, is considered an independent sex entirely. We're going to, in fact, we can look at this right now. This amazing line from Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah that says, Rabbi Meir omer androgynos bria bifnei atzma hu, which means Rabbi Meir says the androgynos, he is a created being. He is a creature, or he is a created being of her own. The androgynos, he is a created being of her own. He uses both male and female pronoun in the same sentence to describe the androgynos, which is really unprecedented and wild and wonderful and skillful, right? Because he's writing in a language where everything is gendered. You can't hedge in Hebrew the way that, before they had before they became a sort of choice of pronoun for people who see themselves in relation to gender in a particular way, we used they to hedge around gender. When you didn't want your family to know the gender of the person you were going out with, you would refer to them as they. I'm going to a friend's house. Yeah, they're really nice, right? So that's a hedge you can do in English. You can't do that hedge in Hebrew. You are stuck revealing someone's gender whenever, the moment you start talking about them. And Rabbi Meir undermines that by talking about the androgynos using masculine gender and feminine gender in the same sentence. I think that's just a really remarkable, wonderful, interesting thing. So androgynos is an independent sex. And then this is the interesting stuff. So mostly treat as male regarding religious duties and marriage, male or female regarding ritual purity. Does the androgynos have to go to the mikveh? Right? Depending on and depending on either male or female, depending on what the particular bodily discharge seemed to be. The androgynos may not lodge in like the house with the women, nor in the house with the men. So that's a really interesting. I keep looking over at Leah. That's a really interesting piece. That because just an interesting piece that the androgynos ends up gender segregated from everybody except other people who are androgynos. The tumtum treat as male with the limitations that apply to uncircumcised and infertile males, right? There are things that uncircumcised men can't do. So you treat the tumtum as male, but more restricted. The tumtum can marry, this is so interesting, can marry a man or a woman. And then there's some differences in inheritance, and there's the possibility that if through surgery genitals are revealed with greater clarity, then that might change how this person is treated legally and socially, or legally at least, in this scheme. Saris, you wait until they're older and you see what their sexual characteristics are. Ayalonit, you treat as if they were an infertile woman. She can marry, and her marriage is enforceable if her husband knew she was an Ayalonit when they married, but if he didn't know, then he can divorce her because of that. He can annul the marriage. So, okay. So here's my question about this. Like, there's a part of me that thinks, right, like, these are people who realistically understood the natural variation in human bodies. They knew intersex people. They knew people who fit these descriptions. Because, the village helped each other with the children. The children ran around naked, whatever. It was not considered out of the ordinary. So then my question is kind of, what does this mean for us if we're imagining, if we're projecting ourselves back into the era as transgender people, the way we kind of understand transgender now? Because what we see here, even if there are physical anatomical requirements to be treated as one category or another, children are growing up seeing a range of gender expressions, are seeing a social place for people with different genders. And I can't help but wonder, let's say I have typical male anatomy and I don't experience myself as male. What are my chances of working my way into one of these categories? Is anyone going to check? I don't know. Do I get to go? Can I find a way to go live in the house where the androgynous people live, who can't lodge with the women and can't lodge with the men? It just feels to me like there are opportunities here for folks, even if their anatomy is typical in some way, there is some kind of flexibility here um, within this system. And there isn't a way to document this one way or the other, but certainly I would have been happy to know that these folks were around, and I would have found my way to um, to connect with them. Again, we're not we our tradition recognizes the range of sexual anatomy. Our tradition creates a range of social roles, rights, and responsibilities based on anatomy, but some of these are pretty wild. You know that that there can be people with an anatomy that will allow them, that will permit them legally to marry a man or a woman. There's something about that that is just remarkable to me, and I feel like if we look back and see ourselves in those times, that would have been exciting and meaningful for us as well. We even have a midrash about Abraham and Sarah, that they were tumtumim, that they were also intersex, and this is, I think, a way of telling the story of Sarah's infertility. You know, all of these hero stories, right? All of these mythic hero stories begin with a woman who can't conceive. You know, and this happens not just in Jewish tradition, but certainly in our tradition, in Torah, and throughout Torah, there are all these stories of women who can't conceive, and then miraculously they do. And with Sarah, we have the story that she's 90 years old and she conceives. And what a miracle that was. And then the rabbis say, no, it's more than that. And they find textual proof for it in the ingenious way that rabbis can reach anywhere in the Hebrew Bible and find something to support the view that they want to put forth. They say, not only was she 90 something years old, she was also not a woman. She was a tumtum. She was a different gender. She didn't have, Rashi says she was an Ayalonit. That was another one of the genders. That not only, it wasn't that she had a uterus that was not functioning. She didn't have a uterus, right? So then that makes the birth of Isaac a greater miracle. So what do we do with that? You know, it feels to me a little bit like if there were something shameful about being a tumtum or about being an Ilonit, then I'm not certain that the rabbis would have gone there, right? If there was a social shamefulness about that particular gender configuration, they wouldn't have come up with this story. But not only was she that old, not only had she been infertile her whole life, but she didn't even have a uterus because she was an Ilonit, because she was intersex in this particular way. That means to me that, again, they knew people who were tumtumim, they knew people who were Iloniot, and they understood it as a fact of human bodies and human culture, and they don't talk about it in ways that are derogatory or shaming. And so I find that super interesting as well. So I'm going to stop the share. We've got maybe another 8 minutes or something, and I know that was a lot of material, and it wasn't homiletic. It wasn't, I wasn't giving you a speech, but giving you a bunch of texts with a bunch of interesting ideas about how our ancestors understood gender, how they wrestled with it. And my hope is that something comes of our seeing ourselves in the tradition. and that we, even in coming from a culture where, what was considered cross-dressing in a gender binary system was prohibited, we can still say, yeah, but there is all of this discussion in our tradition and all of this recognition of different sexes or different genders. And it's just not as simple as you people right now are saying when you get up in Congress and say there are only two genders. It's not as simple as that, and we will not. We will work to make it so that the discrimination doesn't happen and the threat doesn't happen, and that will require work moving forward. But we can tell you right now where we stand right now that what you are saying about gender is untrue. So let me throw this open for, I haven't had the chat open. I'll take a look. But let me throw this open for your thoughts, questions, comments. Cindy, do you want to tell us about the article you wrote?
I have to remember the details, but I wrote it. This is the blog I keep for work on my novel. And one of the interesting things is that I noticed that you did, it's talking in great detail about intersex, but nothing specifically about this. So, about, knowing that you are a different gender than what your genitals are telling, different story. And also a lot of the descriptions they have of intersex are things that don't exist. So it may sound, when you just give the vague definitions, that, oh, well, this could exist, that a lot of them, they're not real.
I'll disagree with you about that. I sat with the descriptions. I sat with intersex advocates who were doing medical work, and they were like, well, that could be how the ancients would have viewed this condition. That could be how they would have described this condition.
I mean, I take that based on what other commentators have said in the text that I found, modern people. But yeah, if you went through it in more detail, perhaps, then sure.
If they didn't exist, then it reopens the question of what was the category? Who were those people?
Well, they existed in some form, but not necessarily in the exact ways that they're being described.
Right.
I mean, certainly androgyny is, in some way is real, and intersex is real, and there's different expressions of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah. I suspect that they were describing bodies that they knew in some way. They weren't mythologized bodies the way, people talk about hermaphrodites or something like that. And they weren't mythologized. They were real people's bodies. But if they weren't, then one has to ask, so why do we have a category called tumtum if we don't? So who gets to why? And that might actually be another opening for people where what you were talking about like, what if my gender doesn't agree with my anatomy, and maybe this is the category where I slip in because it.
Why do they never mention people that, oh, genitals unambiguously male, but the person is female, or or the other way? Why is that not even mentioned? It's only about genitals.
Yeah, thanks. It's true. I mean, and that's a question we're left with, right? We don't see transgender people in the tradition, in that era of the tradition, in the ways that we understand transgender. We don't see it. So why don't we see it? It might be what gets suppressed. It might be that the way we think of gender now is just so different from how it was thought of then. Basha.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned earlier, when you forbid something, that means that it's happened. And there's very clearly, as you showed and I know that part too, that men should not dress as women, women should not dress as men. So obviously they did. Otherwise, why say it? So that's pointing to what Cindy is talking about.
Yeah, thank you. Right. That is probably where we might see ourselves as transgender people, because what's described as a man dressing as a woman might be what we would now describe, what we would now experience as a transgender woman.
Well, we often, it shows up first in the dress. I mean, somebody who wants to be female, who's male, will be, well, they've shared that, that Yiska shares it. She used to dress up in girls' clothing when, it's very commonly known. This is known. So that is a sign of the transgender,
And it might be,
right?
yeah, right. And it might be that that is the spot where we find ourselves, right? That is the spot where we locate ourselves.
Hi, it's Robin.
Hey, Robin.
Yeah, in the mid-70s, the term androgyny began to circulate among lesbians, who we have a long history of dressing however we want, but particularly butch lesbians, which I did not identify myself as quite then. I did androgyny, though. I thought, oh my God, yes, that's who I am. And I was described as a little left of blue. Yeah, somebody described me that way in Austin. But we
Robin, what does that
crossed
mean? What
gender
does that mean?
lines.
What does
Say
that
what?
mean? What does that mean? A little left?
A little left of blue. That's
Oh,
this.
oh, I see.
That was a description given to me in Austin by another woman
Okay.
describing my butchness.
Right. Okay. I got it. Blue.
But I have been mistaken for a man, not just because of the way I dress, but because, for instance, my shoulders are broader than my hips, and all the women in my one side of my family are that way. So it's sort of an obvious mark for people to think I am male.
Yeah.
And I have still addressed at the age of 89. I am still addressed that way occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I make it amusing. One time I said, not in my mother's hearing, taking her out to lunch, that I was a lesbian grandmother. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Maeve, were you raising your hand?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that Paige wasn't missed out on. She put something
Yeah.
in the chat a couple of minutes ago.
Thank you. Paige says, forgive me, I know I'm late to the discussion, but doesn't this cover a shamanistic person who embodies both, like two spirit, someone born marked spiritually? Were you, Paige, I don't know if you're referring specifically to one of the categories. I do think we might see the remnant of that, of what you're talking about sort of the two spirit shaman. That might be what we see in the prohibition of being a kadesh or a kadesha. We don't really have a way to know, but we do know that at least later, after Torah times, those kadesh and kadesha terms, which certainly refer to people in some kind of priestly caste, was seen as problematic on a gender level as well. We see it both in that we looked at the Onkelos translation of it, and also that later on in the Latin, in the Vulgate, it gets translated as effeminati, which is really super fabulous and interesting. So yeah, I mean, it is likely that in sort of pre-patriarchal, pre-Israelite something that some kind of maybe two-spirit shamanistic caste existed, and that would be a place for people, who now might identify as transgender, to take refuge and find fulfillment and nourishment and be cherished for their gifts. And that's what gets suppressed in the prohibition of people becoming kadesh and kadesha.
Thank you for that description, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I find it very interesting that that the idea, like for example, choosing to dress how you want is one thing, but being born embodying energies that one would be marked spiritually and go through initiations and such, as is described in the Native American traditions, is probably something that I would have imagined would have been became taboo, rendered taboo during the patriarchalization of the formalization of the religion 5,000 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a tremendous loss.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, and because I don't think that, I mean, for me, it's like dress however you want, it doesn't really matter, right? But then it's sort of like the idea of like a superficial identity as opposed to an intrinsic one that would require rigorous tests spiritually, is definitely an interesting discussion of the intersection between spirituality and gender.
Yeah, I'd probably love to hear from you another time what you're calling a superficial identification versus something else. Because I'm not certain in any of the things that we've discussed, we're looking at anything superficial.
Oh, I just meant the idea of like choosing to identify a certain way because of a rejection of a socially imposed norm, as
Yeah.
opposed to
Yeah.
like based on what was just said about the anatomical aspects of these.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to just flag that I'm not certain. Uh, I'm I'm not certain how many people I know are identifying themselves gender-wise as a means of rejecting the norm. Um, so I just want to sort of problematize that and flag it for another conversation on another day. We are late because look, nobody stopped me. This is what happens when you don't stop me. But I see it's 10:34, which means we have a whole minute to move and breathe before Rabbi George begins. But let me just bring us in for a landing by saying there's this material is exciting, interesting, heartbreaking, satisfying, and unsatisfying. But it is part of our lineage. And I want to encourage us to reject folks that say that there is nothing there, and that there is nothing there. We know that this comes to us through our lineage, whether it's been prohibited or celebrated, and it's there, and it's for us to hold um, to hold um, and nourish. So let's take a moment to move around and breathe, and then we'll look forward to Rabbi George.